objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time without objection. Members of the full committee not on this subcommittee are authorized to participate in today's hearing. This hearing, entitled "There is No Pride in Prejudice, Eliminating Barriers to Full Economic Inclusion for the LGBTQ plus community." I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. Good afternoon, and I am pleased to convene the Subcommittee on Diversity and Inclusion for a hybrid hearing entitled "There is No Pride in Prejudice, Eliminating Barriers to Full Economic Inclusion for the LGBTQ plus community." In 27 states, there are no explicit statewide laws protecting people from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity in employment, housing, and public accommodations. At the federal level, there are no fair housing or credit protections based on expressly sexual orientation or gender identity. This puts many LGBTQ plus individuals at risk, youth at risk, or at experiencing chronic homelessness, unemployment, or being unbanked. We are a nation of many colors, a rainbow, if you will, and today we will explore the LGBT community and what it faces: systemic barriers to financial inclusion and employment simply because of who we are. Just the other day, I was at a metro high school where young students in a STEM program had one of their categories as LGBTQ plus because they understood the value of diversity. What a great preview for today in having me to have this hearing and to have so many experts. Today, we know it has been documented by a recent Gallup poll of 2021 that 18 million adults are self-identified as LGBTQ individuals. These are our family members, our colleagues, our friends. And every day, these individuals face bigotry, discrimination, especially when it comes to securing safe and stable housing. I joined with my colleagues to pass H.R. 5, the Equality Act, that would prohibit discrimination based on sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity in any area, specifically including unemployment and housing. This bill is currently pending in the Senate, but the founding principles in our community are clear. All men and women are created equal and with inalienable rights that one does not forfeit due to their sexual orientation or identity. Yesterday, there was also a young individual there who had written an article on racism and diversity, and he stood so proudly as he escorted adults to talk about the value of that. This young man you'll hear more about as I talk to our expert witnesses, and I will give you a quote then by him as we talk to our witnesses. But let me just say, we have a lot to learn about this agenda, and I certainly look forward to the testimony of our witnesses who will not only enumerate the depth of the challenges, but will also share comprehensive solutions to help our country live up to its values. Now, I yield back the rest of my time, and it is my honor as the chair to recognize the ranking member for 4 minutes for an opening statement, my friend and my colleague, and Congresswoman Ann Wagner.
I thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I want to thank all of our witnesses for joining us today as we examine policies that promote economic success for all Americans, federal protections against discrimination, the benefits of a diverse workforce, and the ways in which corporate culture shifts that create a more inclusive environment are proving effective throughout the private sector, including the financial services sector. Research shows that companies with more diverse workforces outperform their less diverse competitors. Specifically, companies that implement inclusive workplace practices saw an average of 6.5% increase in stock performance compared to industry peers. Additionally, inclusive companies are able to better attract talented candidates and retain their workforce. A 2017 study by Deloitte found that 80% of respondents said that workplace inclusion was an important factor when choosing an employer, and the business community has taken notice. In this subcommittee, we have discussed ways that a business can improve retention and develop a more inclusive workplace. Those best practices, including transparency regarding salaries and promotion opportunities, mentoring and sponsorship programs, employee resource groups, and flexible work hours for working mothers and families, to name just a few. I believe that every American should have equal access to economic opportunities, and I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses. I'd now like to take this opportunity to yield 1 minute to my friend and colleague from North Carolina, the ranking member of the Financial Services Committee, Mr. Patrick Mchenry.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Wagner. Certainly appreciate your leadership on these very important issues and how we, more importantly, drive inclusion across our economy. The promise of the American dream is that if you work hard and you play by the rules, you can achieve success. Unfortunately, we know that dream is not reality for everyone. And where we find barriers to economic inclusion, we must knock them down. Where we find discrimination, we must eliminate it. Every American deserves access to the opportunities, tools, and services that can make the American dream a reality. I want to thank our witnesses for being here, and I thank the ranking member for yielding. I want to thank the chair for holding the hearing, and I yield back.
I thank you.
Thank
I
you.
thank the ranking member, and I yield back the balance of my time to the chairwoman. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It now gives me the great honor to recognize the chairwoman of the full committee for 1 minute, the Honorable Congresswoman Maxine Waters.
Thank you so very much for holding this important hearing, Chair Beatty. The fight for LGBTQ plus rights is far from over. While same-sex marriage and other milestones of LGBTQ plus equality have become a reality within the last 10 years, this community still faces discriminatory barriers and financial burdens. For example, data show that individuals within the LGBTQ community often have more trouble finding affordable and safe and equitable housing. Across America, an estimated 20 to 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ plus. Additionally, the LGBTQ plus community face difficulties in accessing employment opportunities and being positively included in workplace environments. Compared to other heterosexual and cisgender counterparts, I'm proud that this committee is ensuring that these kinds of disparate impacts are not tolerated. Thank you again, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you to our chairwoman. Today we welcome the testimony of our distinguished witnesses. First, we have Mr. David Johns, the Executive Director of the National Black Justice Coalition. Next, we have Mix Spencer Watson, the President and Executive Director of the Center for LGBTQ Economic Advancement and Research. And then we have Ms. Tanya Asapanza Johnson Walker, the co-founder of New York Transgender Advocacy Group and Transgender Women's Support Group Facilitator, SAGE. Last, we have Mr. Todd Sears, a principal and founder of Out Leadership LLC. The witnesses are reminded that their oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. You should be able to see the timer on your screen that will indicate how much time you have left. When you have 1 minute remaining, a yellow light will appear. I would ask that you be mindful of the timer and when the red light appears to quickly wrap up your testimony so we can be respectful of both the other witnesses and the committee members' time. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. Mr. Johns, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation on your testimony.
Thank you. Chair Beatty, Ranking Member Wagner, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for allowing me this opportunity. My name, as has been said, is David Johns, and I honor serving as the Executive Director of the National Black Justice Coalition, the nation's most preeminent civil rights organization focused on empowering Black LGBTQ+ and same-gender loving people, families, and communities. If there's one thing I want this subcommittee to hear me say, it's that while the beautifully diverse Black community is burdened by the problems caused by racism, Black people with intersectional identities are often confronted with additional nuanced challenges too often neglected and ignored. I will not read my written testimony, but think it important to highlight 3 things. First, students who are or who are assumed to be LGBTQ+ lack the protections afforded to their peers, and the challenges they face in schools make it difficult for them to be happy, healthy, and successful later in life. My doctoral dissertation, titled By Any Means Necessary, Supporting the Learning and Development of Black LGBTQ+ SGO public school students in the US, calls for increased investments in school and community-based supports for LGBTQ+ youth and national interoperable data sets that acknowledge many of us have intersectional identities that shape how we experience public institutions like schools in powerful ways. And when I think about this, I often think about Hope, an Afro-Latinx trans student who describes her middle and high school years as, quote, treacherous. When Hope was beaten in a school hallway by 3 male-identified classmates, surrounded by peers who laughed at the sight of blood painting her face and the floor, she was suspended and told she could prevent the abuse by changing her identity. As a former classroom teacher, I know that students cannot demonstrate what they know or have learned if they do not feel safe. And we know, based on data collected with our colleagues at GLSEN, that Black LGBTQ+ students find schools to be hostile and unwelcoming spaces, which often results in them failing to develop the skills, experiences, and relationships needed to be successful later in life. Second, as you know, what happens to students in schools has a profound impact upon life opportunities and outcomes, especially Black LGBTQIA+ and same-gender loving youth who are often forced to begin their journey into adulthood early. As a result of familial and social rejection, LGBTQ+ young people are overrepresented amongst homeless and foster youth, and Black LGBTQ+ youth are significantly overrepresented in both of these spaces. Young people experiencing housing instability are less likely to complete school, making it difficult to find success as an entrepreneur or to obtain a good job. At the Black Institute 2021, an event that NBJC hosts annually, members of our community described being denied interviews, being let go or laid off, and being denied promotion opportunities. And when discrimination occurs only due to race, gender, sexual orientation, or gender identity, thanks to a recent US Supreme Court Bostic decision, filing an EEOC claim is an option. However, when one experiences employment discrimination or other forms of discrimination based on race and sexual orientation or more, the pathway to federal legal remedy for harm is more complicated and plausible at all. It is imperative that we close this legal loophole created by not protecting people discriminated against due to marginalized intersectional identities. And I thank those of you who voted for the Equality Act. Once codified, the Equality Act will aid in addressing this legal loophole. And the Equality Act is also important when considering how home ownership and housing stability facilitate economic stability in the US. More than half of the states throughout our country still lack laws explicitly banning housing discrimination against LGBTQ+ Americans. We often face discrimination when working with real estate agents, requesting loans for housing, and when seeking shelter. NBJC's own Deputy Executive Director for Programs and Policy, Victoria Kirby York, experienced housing discrimination when moving from Florida to Maryland. After meeting with a realtor to tour a condo in Maryland, She and her wife were assured that an apartment was available and that they possessed a qualifying credit score. And it was only during a post-tour conversation when the two women referenced each other as spouses, which made it clear that they were not simply friends splitting the rent, that the realtor then ceased all conversation between the property owner and the couple. After that painful experience, Victoria and her wife, who was a homelessness prevention social worker, decided to purchase a home. And during their housing search, they received dramatically different home mortgage interest rates from banks. As many of you know, an APR 4.25 compared to 3.25 makes a significant difference in how much an FHA loan will cost after 30 years. Their credit score or financial situations did not change during this process, only the institution and the persons processing their applications. To be clear, the Equality Act would provide a federal remedy for couples like the Yorks and single members of our community seeking housing security and stability. And while protections based on race exist, federal law does not explicitly protect same-gender loving couples or spouses from housing discrimination. Poverty and toxic stress caused by housing, food, and employment instability and insecurity increases the likelihood of significant physical, mental, and emotional challenges. And collectively, we witness this sequence of actions cripple communities for generations. Leveling the playing field to ensure that every American has economic opportunity is essential to preserving our democracy. And it's especially important for Black, LGBTQ plus, and same-gender loving people, communities, and families who disproportionately struggle economically, often to no fault of our own. I hope that somewhere in between these words, I have made clear the need to eliminate barriers for full economic inclusion
Thank you.
for
The
Black
gentleman's time
LGBTQ plus
is up.
people.
The gentleman's time is up. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Johns. Mix Watson, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation on your testimony.
Thank you, Chairwoman Beatty, Ranking Member Wagner, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing. My name is Spencer Watson, and I am the founder, president, and executive director of the Center for LGBTQ Economic Advancement and Research, or CLEAR. In my testimony today, I'll be sharing some of the most current knowledge about financial well-being and economic opportunities for LGBTQ people and the current state of the LGBTQ wealth gap. Like other underserved communities, LGBTQ people experience a wealth gap as compared to heterosexual and cisgendered peers. LGBTQ people report smaller incomes than non-LGBTQ people do and are more likely to live in poverty than non-LGBTQ people are. 1 in 5 LGBT adults in the United States in 2019 reported earning less than $25,000 a year, which is 1.5 times more often than for non-LGBTQ people. And 1 in 20 reported earning less than $5,000 a year, which was 2.5 times more often than for non-LGBT adults. Transgender people are 4 times more likely to make less than $10,000 a year than the general population. To bridge the gap between their income and their expenses, LGBTQ people are more likely to make use of government benefits and other sources of financial support than non-LGBTQ people are. LGBTQ people are 1.8 times more likely to make use of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, than non-LGBT adults, and are 2 times more likely to make use of government housing assistance programs. LGBTQ people are more likely to be unemployed or underemployed than non-LGBTQ people are. In 2019, LGBT adults were 1.8 times more likely to report that they were unemployed and looking for work than non-LGBT adults were. And 1/3 of LGBT adults who were employed said that they wanted to work more in the previous month. Employment gaps particularly affect younger LGBT adults. 1 in 10 LGBT adults aged 18 to 29 years old were unemployed and looking for work, which was much more often than for non-LGBT peers. LGBTQ people are also less likely to have adequate insurance coverage than non-LGBTQ people are. 1 in 10 LGBT adults did not have health insurance in 2019, 1.5 times more often than non-LGBT adults. And more than 1 in 6 Black and Hispanic LGBT adults did not have health insurance coverage. Insurers are also less likely to offer inclusive plans that cover LGBTQ people's unique health needs, including gender-affirming care and family formation costs, such as in vitro fertilization and surrogacy. And the lack of adequate insurance coverage forces many LGBTQ people to forego needed healthcare and to also pay more out of pocket for the healthcare that they do receive. 1 in 5 LGBT adults without insurance who paid out of pocket for their healthcare paid more than $5,000, which was 1.8 times more often than for non-LGBT adults. Although homeownership is frequently regarded as a principal way for U.S. households to build their wealth and financial security, LGBTQ people are less likely to obtain the benefits of homeownership because they are less likely to own their homes. Less than half of LGBT adults owned their home in 2019, as compared to around 2/3 of non-LGBTQ adults. And those that do own their homes are more likely to be repaying their mortgage instead of to own their home in full. LGBTQ renters were more likely to report that they did not own their home because they could not afford a down payment, or they did not think that they would qualify for a mortgage. And LGBTQ women and people of color are even less likely to own their homes. In 2019, only 43% of LGBTQ women owned their home, and less than a third of Black LGBT adults owned their home. Yeah. LGBTQ households are also more likely to be unbanked and underbanked than non-LGBTQ households are. In 2019, LGBT households were 1.6 times more likely to be unbanked, and were also more likely to be underbanked. Overall, more than 1 in 5 LGBT adults were unbanked or underbanked in 2019. Inadequate access to traditional financial services means that LGBTQ people are more likely to make use of alternative financial services such as check cashers, payday loans, pawn shops, and title lenders. In 2019, 1 in 5 LGBT households had used one or more alternative financial services in the previous year, which was 1.25 times more often than for non-LGBT adults. LGBTQ people are also more likely to apply for credit, but that they are also more likely, when they do apply, to have their applications for credit rejected. Over a third of LGBTQ people who applied for credit in 2019 had their applications rejected, and they were also 1.25 times more likely to be offered less credit than they had wanted. Transgender and gender nonconforming people are also likely to experience difficulties with their credit reports when they change their names. And so I want to highlight the fact that the LGBTQ community is not a monolith, and LGBTQ people come from different racial, socioeconomic, and cultural backgrounds that affect their economic
Mix, your
experiences.
time has expired, but thank you very much. And thank you so much, Mix Watson, for your testimony. Ms. Walker, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation on your testimony. We need you to unmute. You're muted.
Okay, thank you. Hello, members of the committee, and thank you for holding this hearing on an issue that I believe impacts the entire LGBTQ community, or lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning community. But it especially affects those who are transgender, gender nonconforming, and non-binary, or TGNC and B. I am a proud Black transgender woman. I am a combat engineers, Army veteran, and my path has not been an easy one. Despite suffering harassment and abuse verbally, physically, and sexually in the Army, I received an honorable discharge in 1984. I went on to study social work at the College of Staten Island, where I was constantly misgendered by my professors and was eventually ran off the campus for protesting for a out lesbian judge, Judge Karen Burstein, in 1994 against her remarks, against remarks by the borough president, Guy V. Molinari, that, you know, she was an out lesbian and she wasn't fit to serve as Attorney General of New York State. So therefore, I was forced to leave college and I wasn't able to finish my education. So I was forced to leave school abruptly. I was the leader of the lesbian gay group at CSI. I protested for the judge and was then called all kinds of names. A couple of carloads of students rode up to me and called me all kinds of gay epithets. And so I wasn't able to complete my education as a social worker. In 1988, I was severely injured in a car accident, which served as a catalyst for me to come to terms with my identity as a woman. And I decided that life is too short for me to live unauthentically. I tried to find medical care to assist with my transition, but was turned away, laughed at, and in times declared mentally ill. One of my doctors called me schizophrenic and prescribed me pills for a condition I didn't have. From 1990 through 2010, it was virtually impossible to find doctors or other medical providers who did not overtly reject or minimize my issues. They even ridiculed and mocked me for my gender identity. I've been laughed at, misgendered, dead named, which is calling me by the name that was given to me at birth. So that was often a problem in my life. This impacted my life greatly, not only with healthcare, but with my ability to find work and safe housing. Many of my friends and I were unable to find employment because people would not hire transgender folks. Despite being a combat engineers veteran, I was forced to rely on food pantries and kitchens throughout my adult life. I had a lot of problems finding hormones and had to resort to the streets to find them. Today, I'm here to advocate for adequate housing for trans folks who are often misgendered and not able to live authentically and not self-actualized in society as in Abraham's hierarchy of needs. I'm here to advocate for the Equality Act and full inclusion of transgender folks into this arena. Health and finances also impact one's ability to find affordable, safe housing. I myself have been turned away several times and discriminated against when seeking housing. I've heard horror stories from my friends, both through my work at Housing Works, but also through TGNC folks all around New York State. Transgender women either get physically and verbally abused when in female shelters, being told they are men and do not belong, or they get physically assaulted, verbally assaulted, or sexually assaulted. I am here to help get safer spaces created for TGNC people, demanding that there be cultural sensitivity trainings for all staff, even folks doing business with the shelters.
I'm sorry, Ms. Watson, your time has expired, Ms. Watson, and thank you for your testimony. I'm sorry, Ms. Walker, your testimony. Thanks for your testimony. And now, Mr. Sears, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give oral presentation on your testimony.
Thank you very much. Chairwoman Beatty, Ranking Member Wagner, Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member Mchenry, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, I want to really thank you for holding this important hearing today. I sit before you today as a proud, openly gay American, a former investment and private banker, a former chief diversity officer, and now the founding CEO of Out Leadership, a B Corporation and the very first company in the history of the United States whose sole product is equality. Our 88 member companies are predominantly American and employ over 7 million Americans in every state in this country. Distinguished members of this committee, my work with over 1,000 CEOs and hundreds of businesses in the last 20 years has shown me that LGBTQ equality and inclusion should not be political. It's neither a Democrat or Republican issue. Equality is a business issue, and it impacts every American, gay or straight, and it reaches every corner of the economy of our great nation. Since 2008, every study has shown that stock prices of LGBTQ-friendly companies outperform their peers from 6.5% to almost 9%. Additionally, LGBTQ inclusive US companies have higher income per employee, more patents, more trademarks, more copyrights, as well as much higher overall engagement and retention than their less inclusive companies and counterparts. Unfortunately, due to the absence of federal protections for LGBTQ people, the positive benefits of inclusion are not felt universally in the United States. leaving the costly burden to individual companies to navigate a patchwork of state laws. Recent Out Leadership research just revealed that almost 1/3 of LGBTQ people will take a pay cut to move from a state to a state that has more favorable treatment of LGBTQ workers. Diversity efforts have to be inclusive. Time and again, countless federal and state bills are introduced to promote diversity, inclusion, and disclosure that completely omit and exclude the LGBTQ community. LGBTQ people are still not a federally protected category, as has been mentioned earlier today, and that's something most Americans actually don't know. Importantly, as my fellow witnesses have noted today, racial justice and gender equality must continue to be a core and inseparable part of the fight for LGBT equality. The most vulnerable LGBT households in America hold multiple intersectional identities, and that compounds the burden of discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity that they experience. Post-pandemic data shows that LGBT households report economic outcomes that are 2 times worse than heterosexual and cisgender peers, including food insecurity, unemployment, eviction, difficulty paying for household expenses, with LGBTQ Americans of color suffering the greatest impact. This last year, Out Leadership has championed 3 bills at the federal level: HR 1187 on inclusive governance, HR 1443 on LGBTQ access to credit, and of course the Equality Act, which passed the House of Representatives earlier this year. And I want to take an opportunity to acknowledge the leadership of this committee and thank you for your work on this important bill. But on behalf of the members of Out Leadership and the entire business community, we advocate specifically for the following. First and foremost, the passage of the Equality Act. Without it, LGBTQ people will continue to be subject to state-level discrimination and the constant chipping away of federal protections, even as we saw just last week from a federal judge around Title IX. The expansion of diversity definitions for board diversity and disclosure mandates to be LGBTQ inclusive and intersectional for all regulated entities and businesses in the US. Currently, there are just 19 of the Fortune 500 who include LGBTQ leaders in the definition of board diversity, and that's resulted in just 29 out board members, or 0.5% of the entire Fortune 500. Next, we'd advocate for the inclusion of data collection on the LGBTQ community in all federal government data collection surveys, as we have recently just seen with the US Census. If we count, we matter. A commitment to the freedom of religion that does not include a religious right to discriminate. And finally, the promotion of economic security and financial stability of LGBTQ people by fostering inclusive labor practices and workplace policies that include access to credit and capital. Distinguished Committee, LGBTQ inclusive diversity is just simply good for business. 25 years of research has shown us that companies with LGBT inclusive policies outperform their peers on every measure of success, from increased engagement to decreased turnover to innovation to stock price. In a market economy, businesses must invest in activities that are in their economic best interest, and LGBTQ inclusive diversity fits that bill. There are clear economic consequences to discrimination as well, which is why 92% of the Fortune 500 already protect their LGBTQ employees, and thousands of US companies have invested in equality, diversity, and inclusion. But individual companies can only do so much. Structural challenges that remain must be addressed by the federal government, and importantly, this very committee. The patchwork of state laws across 29 states where LGBTQ Americans are not protected stands in the way of progress. I ask this committee to undertake this important work, and Out Leadership and our companies stand ready to support you in it. Thank you for the time to appear today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sears, and to all of the expert witnesses today. I cannot tell you how informative, how needed, and how impressive you were in providing information to us. And with that said, I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. We've heard a lot about the exclusion and the impact as it relates to employment, as it relates to housing, as it relates to finances, and a whole host of things. Earlier in my opening statement, I talked about being at the Metro School. There was a young Black man that came up to me who I had mentored, and he shared his experiences over the last few years. And I want to say to DeLaviance, Bert Sims, thank you. Thank you for your work, and thank you for your paper in writing about how we are still dealing with racism. and how we are still evaluating efficacy of initiatives. And let me share with everyone this quote. He said, for example, financial support of the initiatives are not always present in the amount that's needed. We heard that from you. One of the most frequently reported suggestions for better efficacy and equity is better and more commitment to financial support of the initiatives over a long period of time. We need to give more support to our topic today, and hopefully this is just opening the door. With that, let me ask Mix Watson. There are individuals in the LGBT community plus that feel alienated from accessing traditional financial services due to implicit and explicit biases from bank employees. Could you recommend some suggestions or practices that financial institutions can employ or create to be more inclusive?
So yeah, as you mentioned, LGBTQ people, and particularly transgender and gender nonconforming people, do experience harassing and insensitive treatment, frequently from customer service representatives and from financial professionals when they seek financial services. And in order to address that, I do think that it would behoove many financial firms and professionals to engage in cultural competency training in order to increase their understanding and awareness of LGBTQ people's identities and how to provide sensitive and affirming services for them.
Okay, thank you. Only because the clock is ticking. Ms. Johnson, at the federal level, there are no fair housing or credit protections based on sexual orientation or gender identity. Can you share with us if you've had any experiences with LGBTQ plus individuals being denied housing due to the absence of these protections? Is Ms. Johnson still with us?
You're talking to Ms. Walker?
I'm sorry, Ms. Walker. I'm sorry.
Yes, it's okay.
I am so sorry.
Yes, many trans people are denied because their name might not match their documents, and they can be refused housing for that. And most staff are not do not have cultural sensitivity training and are not prepared to meet with a transgender person. I mean, some of the ignorance against transgender people is willful ignorance, and they misgender trans people, which I would consider as hate speech. However, with more ongoing cultural sensitivity trainings to handle TGNC and B customers, I think would be appropriate. And also to change the documentation, change it in the computer. And also it's very important to start collecting data on us. Currently, data is not being collected on the TG and B community.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. I got it right that time. Now, Mr. Johns, there is a poll from the Human Rights Campaign that revealed that the COVID-19 pandemic positioned many LGBTQ plus individuals at a greater risk of being unemployed. Any comments on that?
Yeah, we should be clear that Black people generally and Black LGBTQIA plus people are most likely to be unemployed or underemployed and or show up in spaces where we are exposed to the greatest level of risk. And so providing resources, including loan forgiveness and other forms of reparation and support are incredibly important while we continue to work through the pandemic inspired by the novel coronavirus.
Thank you so much, and my time is up. At this time, I would like to go to the gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, who is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. Mr. Sears, Can you elaborate and tell me why is access to credit important in achieving economic freedom and prosperity? Just in general, before we set the table here.
Sure, sure. Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for your support of this work. I don't think 5 minutes is going to give us nearly enough time to actually answer that question, unfortunately. As my colleagues have noted, access to capital in our country is the underpinning of literally everything that moves our economy. If LGBTQ people can't have access to mortgages, we can't own homes. If we end up paying more as on APRs, as my colleague Spencer mentioned, we are literally being taken advantage of by the system. And so if we look at even the bill that's under discussion, it's about reporting. It's about making sure LGBTQ people are listed in that definition of diversity so that we can measure access to credit and housing and actually how that does impact our economic outcomes.
And Mr. Sears, how can our financial institutions build relationships to foster financial literacy, for instance?
Well, interestingly, they have been for many, many years. One of my favorite programs was at Merrill Lynch many years ago called IPO, Investing Pays
Mhm.
Off, that was started almost 25 years ago on the idea actually that Charlie Merrill, who was the founder of Merrill Lynch, started when he would write widows of World War II veterans and offer advice for how they could invest in their pensions. And so the opportunity for these financial institutions to expand what they've been doing for many years, I think is significant. And they actually are doing it. If you look at Investing Pays Off for Merrill, or 10,000 small businesses from Goldman Sachs. There are significant investments these companies are making, but the challenge is that we don't have the numbers. We don't have the ability for these institutions to provide the access because we're not counted as an LGBTQ community. If Goldman wants to expand their 10,000 small business to focus on LGBT small businesses, the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce is the only place they can go for that data. The federal government does not have that data. So
Well,
once we can actually count, then we can start to be a part of it. Yeah.
well, I thank you for that statement, and that then kind of tees things up for Max Watson, because you talk, Max Watson, about data collection, and can you elaborate on that a little bit more, as Mr. Sears has just kind of teed up here?
Yeah, so there is a significant information gap about LGBTQ people because there is inadequate data collection of sexual orientation and gender identity in federal surveys. So it is important for all data collections where we are examining economic well-being, but really just our communities overall, that we include questions that ask people about their gender and their gender identity, their sex as assigned at birth, and their sexual orientation. And that would vastly improve our understanding of the unique circumstances that LGBTQ people experience. And also, it's important to include these in enforcement data collections, such as the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act or the forthcoming 1071 data collection for small businesses.
Thank you. And Mr. Sears, what steps can financial institutions take to support the and underbanked communities? What are some of your thoughts in that arena?
Well, at the very least, looking at the policies. One of my colleagues mentioned that LGBTQ people are still excluded from so many policies. I would use HSBC Life as a great example. They rewrote the definition of insurable interest to expand that definition to include LGBTQ families, including in places like Asia, where gay couples still have no relationship recognition. And if you look at the policies through every single of these financial institutions, there are significant opportunities to identify those exact same areas. If we're not counted in how these companies approach, then they're not going to be able to actually include us across the board.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for your testimony here today. Madam Chairman, I will yield back the brief time that I have left. Thank you.
And thank you so much. That was our ranking member, Congresswoman Ann Waters, Congresswoman Ann Wagner, and I'm saying Waters because I now see that our chair of the Financial Services Committee is in the room. And so at this time, it gives me great pleasure to yield to Chairwoman Waters.
Thank you very much, Ms. Beatty. I appreciate the opportunity. And I just wanted to make clear that in March of 2021, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau issued an interpretive rule that clarified that the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which outlaws discrimination in lending and credit decisions, includes absolutely protections against sexual orientation, discrimination, and gender identity discrimination. I just want to go further with a question about housing barriers. A large body of research, as I think has been indicated, demonstrates that discrimination threatens access to housing and the stability of individuals in the LGBTQ plus community. Members of the LGBTQ plus community are more likely to experience homelessness while enduring discrimination and harassment that extends their length of homelessness. There are approximately 8,900 homeless youth in Los Angeles County identifying as LGBTQ. Transgender individuals in particular are at an increased risk for violence and discrimination that keep them from accessing necessary shelter and services. In April, HUD issued program guidance on supporting inclusive housing and shelters for transgender people, which includes using transgender inclusive language, intervening in conflicts to promote safety, and holding staff and residents accountable for behavior within shelters. I just want to go to a point of discussion that was not necessarily included in this discussion today. And I don't think that when our witnesses came today, they were asked to include any information about something that is happening in our society today as it relates to transgender. There's a discussion going on right now, a big discussion, and it's about the closing, and it's about David Chappelle, and it's about a woman that we learned about who evidently committed suicide after identifying and working with and opening a show that she had been invited to participate in by David Chappelle. And I have real sad thoughts about her. I think her name is Daphne, and it's Dorman. And I tear up when I think about her. And of course, David Chappelle is a brilliant comedian. And there's this discussion going on, and I'm trying to listen to everything that's being said from the transgender community, or from David Chappelle, on and on and on. I don't want to get into that today, but I don't want us to pretend that this is not going on and that we're only concerned about the housing and the homelessness and all of that. We're concerned about all of that, but we're also concerned about another kind of discussion that's going on. And while I'm not going to ask any particular questions about it today, I would ask that Ms. Tanya Johnson Walker, please give me a call and I will arrange a meeting with myself and Ms. Beatty, because I want to talk to you. And I want you to share with me what is going on, what you think, what you feel, and how, in what way can we show our concerns. So with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you so much to Chairwoman Waters for extending that invitation again. Thank you. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Beatty and Ranking Member Wagner, for holding this hearing today, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. Thank you for sharing your stories and how they have impacted your lives, but also the lives of the communities that you so passionately advocate on behalf of. The work you continue to do to advocate for those in similar situations is admirable. I think it's fair to say, I certainly hope so, that no one on this committee or subcommittee condones any sort of racism, hate, or discrimination. I believe that. I believe that people should not have to live in fear of any kind of violence being perpetrated toward them because of who they are. Additionally, I want to extend my thanks to Ms. Tanya. We have Veterans Day coming up, and you served our country quite admirably, and I've always believed we owe our deepest respect to those who have worn our country's uniforms. It's a big sacrifice, and one that we're grateful for. So I want to thank you for that. In the United States, I think that all people should have access to economic opportunities to create a better future for themselves and their loved ones. That's one of my top priorities here in Congress and on this committee is how do we empower more families, no matter what background you come from, to make sure that everybody has an opportunity at the American dream. I'm the son of immigrants. My father immigrated here from Cuba in the 60s. Certainly had to overcome various barriers throughout his life. And we want to make sure on this committee that we eliminate as many of those barriers as humanly possible for everybody. And with that, I have proudly supported home ownership legislation as one of those initiatives. I've been supporting legislation that would extend protections to people who are discriminated against based on sex or sexual orientation. No one should think that they should be denied housing access because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. I simply don't believe that's right. It's my hope that we can use this hearing to learn more on that topic and find effective bipartisan solutions where problems may exist. Ms. Tanya, I want to start with you, and I really only have one question because I think you mentioned it well in your testimony. You provided a list of ideas that HUD could implement to best benefit the LGBTQ plus community, particularly elders. One was to provide guidance to community partners and share best practices. Could you detail for our committee just what some of that guidance could look like, and what are the best practices that you would think would have the biggest impact for these communities?
Hello. Well, first of all, definitely, we need cultural sensitivity training for all staff and folks doing business, with shelters. We need supportive housing, fully staffed supportive housing, with social workers, mental health professional, and medical care on staff. We also need transitional and permanent housing to help address, the needs of our community. So we need like wraparound services, I would say,
Yeah,
in these shelters and in this transitional housing to adequately provide for the TGNC and B community at this
thank you.
point.
Just as a follow-up, on the sensitivity training side, I think that makes a lot of sense. I guess my question, when confronted with some of the challenges in the shelters with folks who may not be making folks feel as welcome as they otherwise should, is your belief that it's what I would call sort of accidental ignorance, like, hey, I just don't know exactly what to say and do in this situation. I don't want to be offensive, but I don't really know. Or do you think it's more willful discrimination, or sort of a combo of both?
I believe it's a combo of both, and lack of cultural sensitivity training. I think during COVID, trans people that were in shelters were allowed to stay in their own room. I thought that was wonderful, and I like that model, and I think we should keep that model. Uh, Transgender people are not safe in single-sex shelters, which is the male or the female. So I believe that if trans people are housed in their own rooms, that it's safer for them. And I think that that they should have wraparound services in these shelters to help transgender folks succeed in society and not have to return to the shelter. But also to have life skills training available, so they'll learn how to balance a checkbook, how to do credit, how to
The
do
gentleman's
things.
time has
Thank you.
expired, but thank you. And I have a feeling we're going to be coming back asking you a lot of questions. Again, thank you. And thank you,
Thank you.
Mr. Gonzalez. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
a pathway to bring many of your lived experiences to Congress. It's very much missing here, and so I appreciate all of you so much in speaking this truth again that is missing in Congress. I want to give me some time to kind of go down some facts that I think are important. One fact is that an average of only about 49% of LGBTQ plus Americans own a home, which is far less than the overall average, which I think is 64%. These facts are even lower for LGBTQ plus people of color. That's only at 35% of LGBTQ plus individuals. It's even lower than that. It's 35% for LGBTQ Latinos and 30% for Black LGBTQ Americans to own their home. Another fact, which I think is really dramatic, is that LGBTQ plus couples are 73% more likely to be denied residential mortgages compared to their peers, which I know Chairwoman Waters wants to hear about this. The other fact is the National Transgender Discrimination Survey found that among transgender individuals of color, 56% of Native Americans, 52% of Black folks, 51% of Latinx respondents moved into a less desirable home or apartment because of anti-transgender bias forced on them, again, even though they could and wanted better housing. These are just a few of countless statistics I think that are really important. I hate saying statistics because this is lived experiences, real lives. But as you can all see, and for many of my colleagues, housing discrimination against our LGBTQ Americans is a major crisis in our country. 3 years ago in Michigan, only about 3 years ago now in Michigan, a person could actually be fired from their job simply because of who they love. Fortunately, Governor Whitmer eliminated that gross civil rights violation, but it shows just how prevalent these discriminatory laws remain in modern times. I think Ms. Walker, first of all, I cannot stress to you how much you are inspiring so many that are incredibly excited that you are testifying before our committee. And so I wanted to leave some time for you, as well as others on the panel, to really talk about things that we didn't ask you about. The trauma that comes with living as you are in our country, and how do you think we should be addressing it in Congress?
If I may, I want to lift up two things, and thank you for those comments, Representative Tlaib. One is to my Congresswoman Maxine Waters, thank you for your leadership. I want to highlight that we include a section in our written testimony describing the silent epidemic of violence that our trans siblings are facing, which is often hidden in the shadows of the violence that Black people are facing more generally. I've already reached out to Chastity, but welcome the opportunity to further that discussion as well. And then very much related to the previous conversation about the challenges with shelters, I want to offer up two things that are potential remedies that would prevent people from needing shelters. And one is decriminalizing sex work. It is often the case that Black trans folks, in particular Black trans women, are forced into sex work as a result of not being able to show up and are being offered job interviews or promotion opportunities or support in more traditional economies. And so we should have more meaningful conversations at the federal level about decriminalizing that work. And very much related to that, there are a number of Black LGBTQIA+ folks who also face economic hardship as a result of cannabis use or distribution. So decriminalizing cannabis is also something that should be considered as we have these holistic conversations.
If no one else on the panel has more to share, I yield back to the chairwoman.
Thank you so much for your comments, and thank you to the witnesses for responding to our comments. Ranking Member Wagner, do you have any more Republican members in the queue?
Not on yet, but I'll
Okay.
let you proceed through your ranks and we'll see who joins.
Okay, thank you so much. The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Chair Beatty. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Proceed.
Thank you very much. And thank you to those who have come today to offer your powerful testimony. I've been thinking a lot about small businesses. I represent suburban Philadelphia, Montgomery and Berks counties right outside of Philadelphia. And building a small business is the dream of many Americans. And I'm particularly interested in what are the obstacles that LGBTQ plus small business owners and entrepreneurs face in engaging the financial system? Maybe Mr. Sears, I could start with you and then maybe go to Mr. Johns.
Sure. Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for the work that you're doing in Philadelphia. I know my friend and colleague Brian Sims is doing a lot of great work in the state as well. So I want to thank you for that support.
In the Pennsylvania House.
He's quite a tremendous leader in our community and in your state. So to your question, I would say several things. I think if you look at the number of, I'll take it out of LGBT for a second, minorities in the United States start more businesses at a rate that's almost double that of the average population. And why is that? Because of discrimination that still exists in the corporate America structure, despite the fact that 92% of Fortune 500 companies have non-discrimination policies, we all live and work in states that don't actually have that as a trickle down. So even the trailing spouses of people who are protected by the Fortune 500 do not experience that same protection in the state in which they live. And so the reason for the small businesses, I think, is number one, based on that. Then when they get into the marketplace, you look at the access to discrimination that still exists, from religious-based discrimination all the way through to refusal of service laws that still allow people to deny service and to deny credit and access to people based on quote unquote sincerely held religious beliefs. And that is something that we have not talked about in this committee yet, but I do think the religious right to discriminate has to be addressed by this committee. It's not directly related as a financial services quote unquote issue, but it is the single largest reason LGBT people experience discrimination in our country. And it's a false choice that we've created. Over half of LGBTQ Americans consider themselves religious. It is not pitting religion against LGBTQ people, but it has impact on small businesses. It has impact on discrimination. It has impact on the laws that Chairwoman Waters mentioned and the transgender community. There were 131 anti-trans bills in 31 state legislatures in our United States in the last 12 months. They were driven by religious animus, marginalizing and demonizing the most vulnerable of our communities, primarily because these young people want to play a sport. So the opportunity for us at the small business level, all the way through the Fortune 500, to eradicate this discrimination, I think, is significant.
I appreciate that. Mr. Johns, did you want to add to that? And I'm interested if you could address maybe the problem of accessing capital.
Yes, ma'am. I'll say three things related to that, and one is just to underscore everything that my colleague said. One, I mentioned a little bit about it in the testimony, but when I think about the experience that our deputy director had with regard to accessing capital for a home loan, often the discrimination and the ability for the financial service provider or the institution to make decisions about capital it is the challenge, right? It is about a person sitting across the desk from another person, or virtually, when we think about COVID, making a determination based on things outside of their financial portfolio, the things that they can otherwise control. And the one thing that I think is most important in this context, acknowledging the point that Congresswoman Waters made about the March CFBP guidance, is that there is no private right of action. And so what we know is that often members of our community are discriminated. We are denied access to capital. We are seldom given actual meaningful reasons for that. And there is no private recourse or private right of action once that happens to members of our community. And so passing the Equality Act, as it has been passed in the House, would address that, and ensuring that future civil rights legislation includes a private right of action would also help to address moments when financial service providers and institutions fail to do the thing that they otherwise should be doing.
I thank you for all of that important information. And finally, Ms. Walker, I'll address this to you. I read a very shameful statistic. According to our Philadelphia Inquirer, 40% or more of people aged 18 to 26 in Philadelphia, which is my neighboring district and it's my home city, who experience homelessness identify as LGBTQ. Think about that. 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ. What a shameful statistic for our country. Ms. Walker, what are the best practices for assisting LGBTQ plus youth to become connected to permanent housing?
Well, first of all, we need to meet the youth where they are. I worked with Housing Works here in New York City, and we used a harm reduction approach to meeting with the youth. And also we need shelters and transitional and permanent housing with wraparound services in these shelters and in this transitional housing to support this youth, to make sure they're getting they're getting their nutrition, they're getting their
I
their
apologize. My time has expired,
Your
but I
time
would
has
love to, I yield back, but I'd love to get more information from you offline.
Oh, thank
again,
you. Thank you.
again, to the witness, thank you. You're going to be very popular as well as the other witnesses with us today. But the gentlelady's time has expired. And now the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, who is also the vice chair of the Subcommittee on Diversity and Inclusion, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for bringing our attention to this very important hearing. And I first want to start by also congratulating Tanya for her and thanking her for her years of service. And I know Veterans Day is not till later this week, but happy Veterans Day. And thank you for your service. And I hope that you completed that social work school, because that was my first degree in social work. So I hope that you finished. But if not, there's still time. You can come to the University of Houston. We're very LGBTQ friendly in Houston. So come on down. You know, this has been a very interesting discussion this morning, because we know that the difficulties of the LGBTQ community face are not discussed often enough. So thank you again, Madam Chair, for underscoring and highlighting this very important issue. Their struggles and how they're treated are legitimate. We need to focus on them and make sure that they truly do have the economic freedom to build their wealth, to build their homes, and to do, as was stated by the ranking member, you know, have the economic freedom that we should have for all Americans. Of course, all this is compounded when they coincide with other barriers like race, ethnicity, and age, to name a few. LGBTQ plus people are more likely to be underbanked, and thus are more likely to experience barriers to credit access. I've said before that access to credit is access to building wealth, and in turn, this lack of access is deeply concerning. I want to start with Mr. Sears. Mr. Sears, a 2020 report by Equality Texas found that non-discrimination protections would result in addition to the addition of hundreds of thousands of new jobs and millions of dollars added to the GDP and tax receipts. I think you kind of alluded to that when you mentioned, and I was really surprised. You said 1/3 of LGBTQ workers they'll take a 1/3 pay cut to go to a friendlier state. Is the reverse true? With Texas passing a really horrible anti-trans bill this last session, can we expect people to leave the state because we're now becoming more and more unfriendly?
The short answer is yes, absolutely. I've just spent this last week in California meeting with leaders in the tech community, and the Texas bill in particular, and there are 8 other states that have passed anti-trans bills specifically around youth. Those bills specifically came up in the tech community in terms of expansion into Texas. As we saw in North Carolina when HB2 passed, so many, whether it was PayPal or Salesforce, so many companies decided not to invest in North Carolina. Our leadership actually convened an investor statement at that time that was replicated in Texas, actually. We had almost $4 billion worth of assets that were invested in North Carolina and $6 billion that were invested in Texas, of assets that said that the discriminatory policies of both North Carolina and Texas around trans people increase the risk in the marketplace and decrease the return on the assets invested in those states. So there is a direct return on investment for equality, and there's a direct economic consequence to discrimination. So the short answer is yes, absolutely. Companies pay attention to this significantly because their youth, especially Gen Z and Gen Y, won't stand for it. They will not come to companies that are not LGBTQ inclusive. And if those companies are based in states that are LGBTQ unfriendly, which so many states increasingly are, it's an economic problem.
So there's a benefit, but there's also some I don't want to say a penalty, but I guess it is. So I think that's why it's so important to highlight these issues. Next question now is for Mix Watson. You do important work in addressing the barriers that your community faces every day. Can you speak to the issues that are created when the financial services industry is not actively measuring, quantifying, and targeting relief to the LGBTQ community?
Thank you. So I do think that, yeah, the lack of attention that financial firms are paying to the LGBTQ community and the unique issues that they experience, are really, largely because the financial services industry, is very traditional and is frequently relying on systems that were designed with heterosexual, cisgender, and heteronormative assumptions in mind. And so those systems are, less able to, process and, the unique needs of LGBTQ people, and to accommodate things such as name changes, or to recognize people who are of non-normative genders.
I'm sorry the gentlelady's time is up, but thank you very much to the witness, and thank you to our Vice Chair Garcia. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Auchincloss, is now recognized. He is also the Vice Chair of the full Committee of Financial Services. You are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Johns, my question is for you on housing. A study by HUD in 2013 measured the treatment of same-sex couples that they receive from rental agents when inquiring about apartments advertised online, as compared to how otherwise similar heterosexual couples are treated. And the study, which was the first time that HUD had ever studied same-sex housing discrimination, found that same-sex couples received a lower response rate when searching for an apartment than heterosexual couples using identical emails, trying to keep all variables the same except for the sexual orientation of the couple. The Financial Services Committee has had several hearings regarding the importance of housing for employment, health, and education for young people. This has been an issue on which both the chairwoman of the subcommittee and, of course, the chairwoman of the overall committee have been really outspoken leaders. How has HUD worked to remedy the discrimination unveiled by this 2013 study? And has the agency continued to track any rental housing bias for same-sex couples?
I appreciate that. To your first question, what has been done, I'll name 2 things. One is the provision of housing vouchers and otherwise subsidies for housing programs for homeless and low-income people. They have not been targeted with regard to LGBTQIA+ folks. That is a particular issue when we think about the comment that Congresswoman Maxine Waters offered, acknowledging that a disproportionate share of youth who are homeless and in the child welfare agency identify as or assumed to be LGBTQIA+. And so I think that that's the first part of your question. The second part of your question, if I understood it correctly, is have there been accountability around those actions? Was that it?
Accountability, but also has HUD continued, to your knowledge, to continue to track any type of bias, either in rental or actually really in homeowner sales to same-sex couples?
I do not have the answer to that question, but we'll work with our deputy director to circle back and make sure that we provide you with one. What we do know is that, and I think this comment was made earlier by Nick, is that there are very few, if any, federal data collection enterprises that account for intersectional identities, right? And so most surveys, and I make this point in my formal testimony, most surveys, for example, will ask about race or ethnicity with regard to engaging with public institutions like banks or schools, but will not then ask questions about sexual identity, gender orientation, or expression. And then the converse is true when you think about the CDC or NIH. They might ask questions that include sexual health and wellness, but then will not ask questions that also account for race and ethnicity. And so the point here is that we should think more meaningfully about federal data collection and reporting efforts that are not only centering intersectionality, but that are also interoperable.
I appreciate that response. And I want to give anybody else on the panel an opportunity to weigh in on housing discrimination against the LGBTQIA community. All right, then, Madam Chair, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
My mute button was stuck. Thank you so much to our Vice Chair, and let me say thank you to all of our witnesses today, and also to the Chair of the Financial Services Committee for joining us for this full hearing. Ranking Member Wagner, we have exhausted all of our members. If you have no other members coming within accordance of our rules, I can thank our witnesses and adjourn the hearing.
I thank all of our witnesses. It's been most informative. I look forward to things as we move forward. And I know that we'll continue the dialogues that we've begun here today. So I thank you, and Madam Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. And again, we thank the witnesses. And I can tell you by the questions from both sides of the aisle, we have a lot more that we want to hear from you, a lot more to hear. And again, for this first ever D&I subcommittee, we are thankful for you in helping us grow. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their responses. I asked our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the records. I remind members to submit written questions and materials for the record to the email address provided to your staff. Without objections, I would like to enter statements from the Credit Union National Association and the Human Rights Campaign for inclusion in the record. With no objections, the hearing is now adjourned.
Thank you, Madam Chair.